The first frost had not quite let go of the low ground when Orla Renner walked out to the crib behind the barn, and the light coming up over the ridge was the color of a struck match, thin and gold. She was a woman past 50, then, broad through the shoulders and square in the manner of women who have carried feed and children and grief across the same set of years. And she went in her plain homespun dress with the apron still tied from the morning's kitchen work. In her two hands, held against her chest as another woman might carry a sleeping child, she had one glass jar. Inside it, packed close and rattling faintly with each step across the frozen yard, were the seeds of a corn that no one in all that valley wanted any more. Kernels of no single color, but a dozen at once, red and blue and speckled amber and a dull horn white, the ugliest seed corn a man could find in that country. She had 1 quart left, and meant to plant every last kernel. There is one of these stories in nearly every valley, if you go back far enough to find someone who remembers. And this one belonged to a stretch of bottomland along a creek that the old people called the Slaunt, where the hills came down close on both sides and left a ribbon of good black dirt between them. Orla Renner had farmed that ribbon most of her life, and her mother before her, and her mother's mother before that, back to when the trees had first come down. 3 women, one after the other, and a single jar of seed passed hand to hand down all those years like a thing too precious to eat. A jar of scruffy old corn, a woman who would not give it up, and a valley that laughed at her. If you have ever watched a whole community decide that a steady, careful person had simply gone soft in the head for holding on to a thing their own grandparents swore by, then you already understand why a story like this needs telling. Stay with Orla. What the men down at the store were about to learn had been written down, in a dead woman's hand, in a book none of them had ever thought to open. She set the jar on the seat of the wagon and stood a moment looking at her hands. They were large-knuckled and cracked at the thumbs, brown on the backs and pale in the creases, and they had shelled that corn all through the dark of the year, 1 ear at a time, by the light of a lamp turned low to save the oil. It is slow work shelling seed corn by hand when you mean to keep the best of it. You have to look. You have to feel the ear for its fullness, and rub your thumb down the rows to know which kernels sat deep and sound and which had gone chalky at the tip, and set aside the ears that grew off the strongest stalks, the ones that stood up through the wind when their neighbors leaned. Her mother had taught her that, sitting on an upturned bucket in this same crib, and her mother had learned it from the grandmother. And none of the 3 had ever once bought a bag of seed in their lives. The corn they grew from the corn they had grown. That was the entire method, if a person could call so plain a thing a method at all. The trouble was that the world had gone another way, and it had gone that way fast. Inside a few short seasons, every other family up and down the Slaunt had torn open sacks of a new hybrid seed, a uniform kernel bred pure and sold by the bushel, and the fields that came up from it were a marvel to look at. Every stalk the same height, every ear at the same joint, field to the same tip, tasseling on the same week as if the whole field had agreed on it beforehand. A man could stand at the head of such a row and sight straight down it like a rifle barrel and not find one plant out of line. The corn came earlier and taller and all at one time, so that a family could bring in the whole crop in a handful of days and be done. Beside such a field, Orla Renner's corn looked like a beggar at a wedding. Her stalks came up ragged and uneven, some tall and some stunted, the ears set high on one plant and low on the next, and the kernels, when they filled, were that same jumble of colors that made a modern man wince. To the whole valley it was plain as day. She was a stubborn woman farming a stubborn corn out of nothing but pride and grief and an unwillingness to let her mother go. They did not say it cruelly, most of them, and that is worth setting down, because it would be an easier story if they had. The men who leaned on the counter at the feed store and watched her drive past were not bad men. They were her neighbors, and they had helped raise her barn, and more than one had carried a casserole up her lane the week her husband died. But they had put their own money and their own hope into the new seed, and a person who does that does not care to be reminded, even by a ragged field, that the old way might have known something. So they made it a joke instead, because a joke is a soft place to set a thing you would rather not look at square. They called her Con the rag crop. They called her the last of the Renner women who would not come into the modern day. When she came in for nails or for salt, one of them would ask her, kindly, laughing, whether her rainbow corn had made up its mind yet what color it wanted to be, and she would smile a small, tired smile and pay for her nails and go, and behind her the laughter would come up warm and easy. The laughter of men who were certain, absolutely certain, that they had chosen right. Orla did not argue with them. That is the first thing to understand about her, and it is the thing that would matter most in the end. She had learned somewhere down the long years that a person cannot win a valley over with talk, that talk only hardens what it means to soften. And so she let them have their joke, and kept her own counsel and did her work. But she was not planting that scruffy corn out of pride, whatever the storm men believed, and she was not planting it out of grief, though there was grief enough in her for 3 lifetimes. She was planting it because of a thing she had read, and read again, and copied out in her own hand, so as to be sure of it, in a book that her mother had kept and her grandmother had started, and that was the part of the story the whole valley had never once bothered to learn. The book was a plain composition notebook, the marbled black and white kind that school children carry, and there was not one of it but a whole shelf, running back more years than Orla herself had been alive. Her grandmother had begun the first in a hard year, out of a plain need to remember what had worked and what had not, and once a thing like that is begun in a family, it does not easily stop. All 3 women had written in them. The pages were soft as cloth at the corners from being turned, and the ink went from a faded brown at the old end of the shelf to the ordinary blue-black of Orla's own pen at the near end. And had you read them straight through, which no one in that valley ever had, you would have read the whole weather of that bottomland for most of a century. Which years the creek came up and which years it did not. What the corn did in the grasshopper year and the year of the early frost and the 2 years running when the rain simply would not come. And threaded through all of it, in 3 different hands but one steady purpose, the plain, unbroken record of the seed. Which ears were saved, and off which plants, and why. It was not a diary. It was a ledger of survival, kept by women who could not afford to guess. And in that book, in her grandmother's faded brown hand, was the sentence that Orla Renner had read so many times she could have said it with her eyes shut. Keep the corn that keeps you. Not the prettiest ear, the old woman had written, not the biggest. The corn off the plant that stood when its neighbors fell. That was the heart of the teaching, and it was a deeper thing than any man leaning on that counter guessed, because what the grandmother had understood, without ever once hearing the words for it, was that a field of corn all bred to be exactly the same is a field with no argument in it. Every plant will do well in the same weather and badly in the same weather, and take sick from the same sickness on the very same day, because they are, every one of them, the same plant grown 10,000 times over. But a ragged old corn, saved by hand off the plants that stood, is not one plant. It is a crowd. It is a whole quarreling family of plants, no two quite alike, and in a crowd that large there is nearly always someone who can weather the thing that lays the others down. The grandmother had not called it that. She had only written down her line, and trusted the woman who came after her to understand. So on that cold, bright morning, with the frost still white in the shadow of the barn, Orla Renner climbed onto the wagon seat with her 1-quart jar beside her, and she drove the team down to the bottom by the creek where her mother and her grandmother had planted before her, and she began, alone, to put the last of the old seed into the ground. It was slow. Everyone else in the valley had a planter that rode behind a tractor and dropped a modern kernel every so many inches without a soul having to bend his back, and they had their whole crop in before she had finished her first long field. She went on foot down the rows with a hoe and a sack tied at her waist, opening the ground and setting the seed and closing it again with the side of her boot. 3 kernels to a hill in the old fashion, and she took her time, because there was no one waiting on her but the corn. By the time she had the jar emptied and every kernel in the ground, the sun was well down toward the far ridge, and her back had a bend in it that would not come out for 2 days. She straightened at the far edge of the last row and looked at the bare brown field where nothing yet showed. Then she drove home in the dusk and lit the lamp and took down the near notebook off the shelf, and in her own steady blue-black hand she wrote the date and the field and the one line she wrote every year on planting day. Put in the whole of it. God willing, there will be seed to save. The corn came up ragged, as it always did, and the valley took its usual quiet pleasure in the sight of it. Where the hybrid fields broke the ground in one straight green flush, every seedling standing at the same hour like a company of soldiers called to order, Orla's field came up like a family coming down to breakfast. A few early risers first, and the rest straggling after over the better part of 2 weeks. There were gaps where a kernel had rotted in a cold pocket of ground, and doubled hills where 3 had all taken, and the color of the little plants was not even one green, but a scatter of greens. A man driving the county road could tell her field from a quarter-mile off simply by how untidy it was, and more than one slowed to look at it and shook his head and drove on with a smile. The rag crop was in. The last Renner woman had done it again. She let them look. Through the long green weeks of early summer, she was in that field nearly every day, and what she did there was not much to see, which was part of why the valley never understood it. She walked the rows. That was the greater part of it, simply walking, slow with her eyes down on the plants, and now and again crouching to feel the set of a leaf between her fingers, or to part the soil at the base of a stalk and look at the color of the roots. She was reading the field as another woman reads a letter, and she was keeping account of it, because tied at her waist she carried a smaller notebook, a pocket one, and when she saw a thing worth the knowing she stopped and wrote it down. Which corner came on strong, which few plants here and there through the whole field had shot up taller and greener and stronger than any of their neighbors for no reason a person could name. Those last ones she marked. She tied a short length of faded red rag loose around the stalk of each, so that she would know it again in the fall, and by midsummer there were perhaps 200 of those little rags scattered through the field, fluttering, and the men who saw them from the road took them for one more piece of the old woman's foolishness. They did not know they were looking at the whole of the future. For that was the method, plain and unhurried and nearly invisible, and it matched the same practice her grandmother and her mother had worked before her. You do not simply crib the entire crop and plant it back, because to do that is to let the weak breed with the strong and drift year by year toward the middling. You walk the field all season with your eyes open, and you find the plants doing the thing you want, standing straightest, feeling best, shrugging off the dry spell that has the others curling at noon, and you mark those, and in the fall you save your seed from those alone. Every ear she would keep came off a plant she had chosen with her own eyes and her own 2 feet. It is the oldest work in all of farming. And the reason there was such a thing as corn at all, and Orla Renner was one of the last in that whole valley still doing it by hand. The rest had handed the choosing over to a company far away, and taken in exchange a seed that was beautiful and even, and though not a soul among them knew it yet, all exactly, perfectly, dangerously alike. The man who laughed the longest at her that summer was a near neighbor named Cletus Harn, and he is worth the setting down, because he was neither a fool nor a cruel man, and his being neither is the whole point of him. Cletus farmed the big level fields across the creek, and he had gone in deeper on the new seed than anyone else around, plowed under every ragged old thing his own father had kept, and put all of his ground into the one bright uniform hybrid, and his fields that summer were the finest anyone thereabouts had grown. Straight, tall, even, green as a painted picture. He would stand at his own fence line of an evening with his thumbs in his belt and look across the creek at Orla's straggling rainbow field, and shake his head, not unkindly, as a man shakes his head at a child who will not be told. He had said at the feed store more than once that it near broke his heart to watch good bottom land wasted on museum corn, and that somebody ought to put the poor woman out of her misery with a bag of proper seed. It was a good line, and he was fond of it, and there would come a season, not so far off, when he would have given a great deal never to have said it at all. His wife, a plain, kind woman named Delphine, did not laugh. She had grown up 2 hollows over on a hard-scrabble place where nothing had ever come easy, and she remembered her own grandmother saving seed by lamplight. And something in her had never sat quite right with how the valley had turned on a lone old woman for keeping to the very thing their own people had lived by. She said as much to Cletus one evening, quiet, over the supper dishes. "Your grandfather kept his own seed his whole life," she said, "and never once went hungry doing it. A woman who feeds herself off 1 quart jar year on year is not somebody anybody ought to be pitying." Cletus laughed and told her she had a soft heart, and Delphine let it go, because a wife learns which arguments are worth the having and which are only worth the remembering. But she remembered. She would have cause to. There came a stretch that summer, in the deep of July, when it did not rain. It was not yet the great trouble that was coming, only a dry spell of the ordinary kind, 3 weeks, and in 4 with the sky a hard pale blue and the dust rising white behind every truck on the county road, and it was the first small test of the 2 ways of farming, and hardly anyone but Orla thought to watch for it. The hybrid fields, being all one plant, all did the same thing at once. When the water went short, they curled their leaves tight against the noon sun in one great gray-green shudder across whole fields at a time. every stalk pinching in on the very same hour. And though they mostly came through it, a person with eyes could see they suffered it all together. That whatever hurt one plant hurt every plant beside it at the same moment. Orla's ragged field did not do that. Some of her plants curled and some did not, and the ones that did not were the ones she had marked with the red rags, the strong ones, the ones with the deep roots and the something in them that let them stand a dry noon that laid their neighbors low. She walked her rows all through that dry stretch and added rags, and took some away where a plant she had trusted proved weaker than she had thought, and she wrote it all down. When the rain finally came near the close of the month and greened the whole country up again, the valley forgot the dry spell entirely, as a healthy person forgets a small fever. Orla did not forget it. She had it written down, which plants had stood the drought and which had not, and that writing would matter more than anyone could yet have known. Now it must be said plainly, so that the turn of this story lands as it truly landed, that there was a night that summer when Orla Renner came nearer to giving the whole thing up than she ever told a living soul. It was in the worst of the dry spell, when the creek had dropped to a trickle over the stones, and the dust lay gray on the leaves, and she was tired in the deep way that has nothing to do with sleep. And she stood at the edge of that ragged field in the last light and let herself think the thought she had been keeping off all summer, that perhaps the valley was right, that perhaps she was only a grieving woman farming her dead mother's stubbornness into the ground year after year, wasting good bottom land on a museum crop, as Cleta said, for no better reason than that she could not bear to let the old seed die. Across the creek, Cletus Horn's fields stood tall and even and beautiful in the failing light, and hers stood ragged and thirsty and strange. And for one long moment the whole weight of the valley's certainty pressed down on her, and she thought, plainly, I could buy the seed. I could buy the bright seed in the spring like everyone else, and I could rest. It was the closest she came. She went into the house that night, and she did not buy anything, of course, because there was nothing to buy in the dark. But she took down the oldest of the notebooks off the far end of the shelf, the one her grandmother had begun, and she read again in the faded brown ink the old line, "Keep the corn that keeps you." And then she read the entries around it, the record of a dry year long before her birth, when the whole county had lost its crop and one ragged field of this same seed had come through. And she closed the book and sat a while with her hand flat on the cover, and in the morning she went back out and walked her rows. That was the whole of her dark night. No one saw it. She wrote in the pocketbook only the strong plants held through the dry, marked 6 more. It is a quiet thing to read now, that line, knowing what was coming, but it was the bravest thing she did all that year. The corn made, ragged or not, and by the tail of the summer her field had grown up over her head, a jumbled green wall of it taller in some places than others, the tassels coming out at their own separate hours as they always had, so that on any given morning some plants were shedding pollen, and some were not yet ready, and some were already done. And the whole field pollinated itself in a long, loose, overlapping stretch across the better part of 3 weeks. She knew, though few others in the valley did or cared, that this, too, was a kind of safety, that a field which flowered all in 1 week could have that week ruined by a single spell of bad weather, while a field that flowered across 3 would always catch its pollen somewhere. It was one more of the small, quarreling differences that made her ragged crop a crowd instead of a copy. When the ears set and filled, and the shucks began to dry and brown, she went back down every row one last time. And now the red rags told their tale, and she cut and carried home only the ears off the plants she had marked, the standers, the ones that had held through the dry July. And she left the rest of the field for feed, 200 plants and a little more, chosen with her own eyes across a whole season of walking, and off them perhaps 400 good ears, which she hung by their turned-back shucks from the rafters of the crib to dry, braided in pairs over a rail as her mother had, so that the crib that fall was a hanging garden of that impossible corn. Red and blue and speckled and horn white, turning slow in the draft. If a story about a stubborn woman and a jar of old seed has found you tonight, then somewhere in your own family there was very likely a person who kept a thing everyone told them to let go of, a recipe, a patch of ground, a jar on a high shelf, if you know who that person was. I would take it kindly if you left their name in the comments and told me where you are listening from tonight. Stay with Orla a while longer. The hard part of her year had not yet come, and neither had the part that made the whole valley go quiet. She shelled her seed that winter the same as every winter, on the upturned bucket in the crib by the low lamp, the same slow-looking work. And by the time the cold broke, she had her quart jar filled again and a little over, packed tight and rattling, ready to go back into the ground come the thaw. She set the jar on the shelf beside the notebooks, and she wrote in the near book the count of it, the number of years saved, and the number of plants they had come off, and the weather of the year gone by. And she did not know. No one could have known that the jar she had just filled was about to become the single most valuable object in that whole valley, worth more than any tractor or any deed or any bright, expensive bag of the modern seed stacked to the ceiling of the store. She only knew that there was seed to save, and wrote it down. The trouble came the next summer, and it came out of the south and the west on a wet, warm wind, and at first not one soul in the valley knew it for what it was. There had been word of it, as there is always word of a far-off trouble that a person half hears and does not hold on to. A sickness in the corn, they had said, down in the country to the south, a blight that had come up in the hybrid fields and moved fast. But trouble in a far county is a story, not a fear, and the valley had planted the same bright seed it always planted, field on field on field of it, every family but one buying from the same few sacks, bred off the same few parent lines, so that up and down that whole creek there grew a corn that was, for all practical purposes, one single enormous plant repeated 10,000 times over. It came up beautiful as always, and across the water, ragged and late and scattered and strange, came up Orla Renner's rainbow corn, off the quart jar she had filled by lamplight, the seed of the standers, the crowd. The blight was a fungus, though no one in the valley called it that at first. It came on the wet, warm wind as a fine, invisible dust of spores, and it lit on the leaves of the corn, and it grew, and where it grew it killed, spreading gray-brown lesions down the length of a leaf, until the leaf died and the plant behind it starved for the sun it could no longer catch. And here was the terrible, simple thing the whole modern valley had walked straight into with its eyes open and its heart glad, the thing the grandmother had known without the words for it and set down in her one plain line. A blight that can kill one plant of a kind can kill every plant of that kind, if every plant of that kind is truly exactly the same. And the hybrid corn was the same. Every stalk in every field up and down that creek carried the very same nature, the very same doors standing open to the very same sickness, so that when the spores came down, they did not find 10,000 different plants with 10,000 different answers. They found one plant grown across 1,000 acres with one answer, and the answer was no. It moved through the valley in a matter of days, and to watch it come was a thing the older people there would speak of for the rest of their lives. It began as a faint gray mottling low on the leaves that a man had to stoop to see, and then it was halfway up the plants, and then, so fast it seemed to happen between one morning and the next, whole fields went. The green died out of them from the ground up in a spreading gray-brown tide, field after field of that once beautiful even corn browning off altogether, on the same days, because they were all the same plant, and the sickness ran through them as fire runs through grass, all cured to the same dryness. A person could stand on the high county road and watch the whole valley change color. The proud straight rows going out like lamps, and there was nothing to be done for it, no spray a man could buy in time, no rain that would wash it off, because the trouble was not on the corn. The trouble was in it, bred into it in a laboratory far away. The very sameness that made it lovely being the very sameness that let it die as one. Cletus Harn lost his crop inside a single week. He had the most and the finest and the most uniform of any man in the valley, 1,000 acres of the same bright hybrid standing straight as a drawn line, and he watched it die from his own fence across 7 days, all of it browning off together, every stalk on the same schedule, until his fields that had been the county's envy stood dead and gray and rattling in the wind. He walked out into the middle of it, they said, and stood a long while, and could not find a living stalk to put his hand on. "There's nothing," he said to no one, to the dead field, to the wind. "There is not one living thing left in it." And then, because a man cannot help it, because the eye goes where it goes, he lifted his head and looked across the creek. And on the other side of the water, ragged and late and scattered and strange, standing up green and living in a whole valley gone gray, was Orla Renner's field of old seed corn. It was not that the blight had spared her. That is the thing to understand, and it is the thing the university men would spend a long time afterward trying to make the valley grasp. The blight had come to her field the same as everyone's. It had lit on her plants the same as it lit on his. But her field was not one plant. It was a crowd, a whole quarreling family of plants, no two quite the same, grown from the seed of the standers off 100 years of women who had walked their rows and saved the plants that stood, and in that crowd there was argument. Some of her plants took the blight and died of it, as much as 1/3 of them, browning off in scattered patches. But some slowed it, and some, here and there through the whole ragged length of it, simply did not care, shrugged the sickness off as one of her marked standers had shrugged off the dry July the summer before, and stood up green and whole and setting ears, while 1,000 acres of their beautiful even neighbors lay dead across the water. It was not a miracle. It was the plainest arithmetic in all of nature. A field with 10,000 answers in it will always have someone who knows how to say no to the thing that only knew how to ask one question. Her grandmother had not been able to name the science of it. She had only known her one line, and to write it down for whoever came after, and now the whoever came after stood at the far end of a green row in a dead valley and understood all the way down. What the old woman in the faded brown ink had been trying to hand her all along. The valley came to her gate. That is the part of the story the whole county tells, and it is true. They came the way people come to such things, slow at first and then all at once, and they did not come laughing. Delphine Harn came first, before her husband. Walking up the lane alone one evening with her hands folded in front of her, saying little, only standing at the edge of the green field a while with her eyes wet. "My grandmother would have wept to see this," she said at last, and then, quietly, "Is there seed to spare?" Orla looked at her a long moment before she answered. "There is seed," she said. "There is always seed." That was ever the whole point of it. And after Delphine came the others, one and two at a time, the men who had leaned on the store counter and asked whether her rainbow corn had made up its mind what color to be, and they came now with their caps in their hands, and their fine fields dead behind them. "Is there any to be had?" one of them said, turning his cap in his hands. "And would you show a man how it's done? How you go about the saving of it?" Another, an older fellow who had laughed as loud as any, would not quite meet her eye. "It's not too late for us to learn it, is it?" he said, "the thing our own people knew that we threw off." Orla shook her head. "It is never too late to start writing things down," she told him. "That is the true beginning of it, not the seed." The writing. Cletus Harn came last of all, because pride is heaviest in the men who have the most of it, and he came at dusk when he thought fewer would see him. And he stood at Orla's gate a long time before he could bring himself to open it. When he did speak, he did not make a fine speech of it. He was not a fine speech kind of man. He only stood there in the last light with his dead 1,000 acres at his back and her one living field before him. "I was wrong," he said. "I was wrong for a long time, and I said an ugly thing about you, and I'm sorry for it. I called your corn museum corn." He looked at the green rose over her shoulder. "It was my own crop that turned out to be the museum piece. Dead in a week, and yours standing there like nothing happened." Then he asked her, as a boy asks, whether she would teach him. "Show me how a person walks a row," he said. Orla Renner did not gloat. There is no moment anywhere in this story where she stood at the store and told those men what they could do with their bright seed. No evening where she made Cletus Harn stand and eat his words in front of everyone. It was not in her. She had been right for a great many years, and it had cost her a great deal of quiet loneliness, and now that the whole county had come around there was nothing in her that wanted to make anyone pay for the coming. "Come at first light," was all she said to him. "You cannot read a field in the dark." And she opened the gate and let him into the green field and began that very evening to show him the first of it. What she gave them was not the seed, or not only the seed. Seed alone would have run out in a year. What she gave them was the method, the walking and the marking and the keeping of the standards, the whole slow, patient 100-year practice of choosing your own corn off your own ground with your own eyes, and above all the writing of it down. She sat with them that fall and the falls after, and showed them the notebooks, the whole shelf going back to the faded brown hand, and made them understand that the corn was only half of it and the record was the other half. A seed with no knowledge behind it, she told a barn full of them one evening, holding up a single speckled ear, no account of which plant it came off of or why is just a gamble in your hand. She tapped the top notebook on the stack. "The corn is half. This is the other half. Lose either one, and you have nothing." A good many took to it in the hard, humbled seasons after the blight, and up and down the slant there began again to be ragged fields, crowds instead of copies, and jars of hand-shelled rainbow seed on winter shelves. and here and there a plain marbled composition notebook with the weather and the field and the day of it set down in a careful hand. The university men came the next year when the word of it had spread, and they walked Orla's field with their instruments and their forms, and they said in their own language the thing the grandmother had said in hers. They called the ruined hybrid a monoculture, and they called the sickness by its long Latin name, and they called what had saved Orla's field genetic diversity. And they wrote her up in a paper that went out to other men in other states. One of the younger ones stood in her row with his clipboard and said, half to himself, "This is the largest surviving open pollinated population we've documented in the region." Orla, a few feet off with her hand on a green stalk, gave a short, dry laugh. My grandmother was never surviving anything, she told him. She was only keeping the corn that kept her. That is a shorter way to say it, and it fits in the notebook. The young man looked at her, and then he wrote that down too. But she let them have their long words, the same as she had let the valley have its joke. The field had done the talking. It had stood up green in a gray valley and said it all plainer than any Latin ever could. She was an old woman by the last of it, and her hands had gone from cracked to knotted, and the walking of the rows came slower to her every fall. But she walked them, and she marked the standers, and she kept the corn that kept her, right to the end. On the last planting day that she was strong enough to put the seed in herself, she did what she had done every year of her life, the thing her mother had done and her grandmother before that. She came in from the field at dusk with the bend in her back and the dirt under her nails, and she lit the lamp, and she took down the near notebook off the long shelf, beside the quart jar of rainbow seed that had never once in 3 women's lifetimes been allowed to go empty. Delphine, who sat with her often now in the evenings, watched her take up the pen. "The same words every year," Delphine said softly. "You never change them." Orla did not look up. "You don't change what's true," she said, "only what's fashionable." And in her own knotted, steady hand, in the ordinary blue-black ink at the near end of 100 years of writing, she set down the day, the field it went in, and the same line she had written every planting day of her life. Put in the whole of it. God willing, there will be seed to save. Then she closed the book and set it back on the shelf with all the others, in the place where things got written down for whoever came next, and she turned down the lamp, and the jar sat in the dark beside the record of it, waiting for the thaw. If this story found you at the right moment, share it with someone who has been told that the thing their family kept, the old way, the stubborn patch of ground, was not worth the trouble of keeping. And if you have ever held on to a thing everyone told you to let go of, and lived long enough to be proven right, or are still holding on and waiting, I would truly like to hear about it. Every comment gets read.